Welcome back to the last part of this lecture. In this part of the lecture, we'll be looking at the terms, the directional terms, and other anatomical terms that we're going to use in this course, as well as planes, etc. As I mentioned at the very beginning, the language of anatomy is very important, as it is in all fields of biology. And so we have special terminology that is used that is specific to anatomy and physiology. And the reasons that we use it is because it's specific. It only has one meaning. So when you say leg, for example, you're talking about usually in everyday life, you're talking about both your forearm, the whole arm from your shoulder clear down to your wrist. In anatomy and physiology, when we say arm, we mean something different. Same thing with leg. So we usually think about leg from hip down to your ankle. We're talking about leg. In anatomy and physiology, we're just talking about our calf area. So there's these terms that are very specific to anatomy and physiology. So let's take a look at some different terms here. The first thing to point out here, though, is something called anatomical position. What is meant by anatomical position is what this little figure here is showing. So when someone is in anatomical position, they look just like this figure does here. So you're facing forward, and your feet are also forward, spaced evenly apart. Your arms are down at your side, and your palms are also facing out or facing towards the front. This is anatomical position. It might be useful for you to stand up and get an anatomical position just to feel how that is. The reason anatomical position is important is because all of the terms in anatomy refer to an individual in anatomical position. And when we talk about directional terms, that is also referring to anatomical position. Another thing to point out at this point right now is the idea of right versus left as well. So when you're talking about something's found on the right versus left, in this picture here, this is going to be the right side, this is going to be the left side. And so you'll recognize right off that when you're talking about right versus left in anatomy, you're talking about it from the view of the patient, or from the view of the picture that you're looking at here. So this individual in this picture, his right side is the right side that you're referring to. Even though when you're looking at the picture, that's on your left side, it's still the right side. That's very important. You can see all these body landmarks: the frontal, orbital, nasal, buccal, oral, etc., etc., etc. These terms here are all very specific landmarks. They refer to a very specific part of the body: the acromial, deltoid, brachial, antecubital, etc., etc., etc. These terms are important to learn to understand anatomy and physiology, as well as the landmarks on the back. And you can see these in your book as well. These are two pictures from your book. So I recommend that you learn these different terms so that when we're talking about a part of the body, you'll recognize what that part is. We'll go ahead and use these terms. Let's start with this picture here, but we'll go ahead and use these terms as we talk about directional terms as well. Now, what directional terms are, they're terms that we use to compare. An important thing to remember here is the comparison, or the relationship of parts of the body. So whenever we're looking at directional terms, we're comparing one part of the body to another, such as the frontal versus the inguinal. How do they relate to each other? So I'm going to go ahead and write these down. And something else to recognize here is that these terms also come in pairs. So we have what's called superior and inferior. And superior means towards the head, or the upper part of the body. Inferior is towards the bottom, lower part of the body. So whenever we're using these two terms, we could compare different parts of the body. So for example, we would say that the fibular is what to the orbital region of the body. Is that going to be superior or is that going to be inferior? Well, because we said fibular first, we'd say the fibular is inferior to the orbital region of the body. However, if you switch it around, you could say that the orbital region of the body is superior to the fibular part of the body, the fibular. So you see how these two terms correspond with each other. Depending on which one you're comparing to which part, that's going to determine which term you're going to use. Okay, we have ventral versus dorsal. This is another pair here. Ventral, talking about, in the case of a human, talking about the front of the body. Dorsal meaning the back of the body. You may have heard of dorsal before, and one way to remember this is think about, for example, a dorsal fin on an animal or on a dolphin. The dorsal fin is always found on the back of the dolphin or the shark or whatever it may be. So the same in humans, the dorsal is going to be our back. The ventral is going to be the front. Again, comparing two terms. You could say your abdominal region is what as compared to your back or your scapular region. Go back here. So your abdominal region is going to be ventral, on the ventral side of your body. Your scapular region is going to be on the dorsal section of your body. So those are two terms that are used there. The next two terms here, we have medial and we have lateral. Again, going together. Medial meaning towards the midline of the body. So if we were to draw a line right down through this guy's head here, here's the midline of our body. So medial is whatever is found closer to this line, and lateral is whatever is found farther away from that line. So let's compare, for example, your deltoid region and your sternal region here. Which would you use to compare these two? Let's say the deltoid is blank to the sternal region. The correct answer here would be the deltoid region is lateral to the sternal region because it's found farther away from this midline than the sternal region is. The sternal region is medial to the deltoid region because the sternal is found in the middle. So those are how those two terms are used. Then we have two more, proximal and distal. Another pair. Proximal means closer to the origin of the body. Distal is going to mean farther away. Often use these when we're talking about attachments or limbs. So if we're looking at our arm here, so here's our arm. Kind of highlight that for you there. So when we're talking about parts of the arm, for example, we have the carpal region. We also have the antecubital region. Because these are on the attachment, here is the origin with the body. Okay, so anything farther away from this origin, out towards your hand, is going to be distal. Anything closer to it here is going to be proximal. So in this case, carpal region, the carpal is distal to the deltoid. The deltoid is proximal as compared to the carpal region. Hopefully that makes sense. These two can somewhat be confusing. Let's look at one more just to make this clear here. So if we look at our leg here, let's look at, for example, your patellar versus your digital area. Okay, so your digital area is blank as compared to the patellar region. Correct answer here is the digital is going to be distal to the patellar region. So it's farther away from that origin of the body, which in this case is going to be right here, where it's connecting to the body. The last two that I want to point out are superficial versus deep. Superficial means on the body surface, deep means below the body surface. So for example, the skin is very superficial as compared to the bones. But then if you compare bones versus muscle, Now we have things that are both inside the body, but now we're looking at how they compare to each other. In general, the muscle is going to be superficial to the bones, and the bones are going to be deep to the muscles. Again, this is a pair here that are used related to one another as we're looking at the relationship between the different organs in the body, or different parts of the body. Okay, so those are some terms to learn and to know. One other thing here to point out are the planes. So as you know, a large part of anatomy and what we're going to be doing in this class is cutting things up. And so whenever you make a cut through the body, we call that a plane. So depending on the cut that you make, what you see is going to be different. And so it's important to understand how that cut, what that cut is, and also what the name of that cut is. So in this picture here, we have an individual, and you can see this individual has been cut in three different ways. Depending on how the person is cut, we have a different name for that, and we also have a different image that we're going to see. And you can see down below here where we have the different images that come from these different planes, these different cuts. And this is important when we're looking at, depending on the cut that we make, that we're going to see organs differently. So in each case here, we're cutting through the body, and we're looking at similar organs that are going to look very different depending on what we're looking at. So as we look at different pictures throughout the semester, I'll try to remember to point out what type of plane we're looking at, so you can get your bearings and know what we're looking at. So if you were to stand straight up and you were to cut a line straight down through your body, okay, we call that the sagittal plane, or in this case, under the picture here, they called it the median section. The median section is a special word for what we call the mid-sagittal, and you can kind of see this here written down below. So sagittal is any cut from going straight down through your body, cutting it into two halves, a right side and a left side. That's going to be a sagittal cut. If, however, you cut right down the middle of the body, that's going to be a mid-sagittal, so you're right down the middle, or a median cut. Okay, then we have the frontal cut, as shown here. In the frontal, you're making a cut from top to bottom, but you're splitting the body into a front and a back. So if sagittal does a left and a right, the frontal does a back and a front. And then finally we have the transverse plane. And this is often called a cross section as well. The transverse plane, you're cutting the body into a top and a bottom. And you can see in these pictures here how, depending on how you make the cut, you're going to get very different pictures. So the sagittal cut versus the frontal cut versus the transverse plane are all going to have very different, you're going to see very different things in each of these cuts here. The last thing to talk about in this section is what's called body cavities. Here's a picture of the body cavities. Before we talk about the cavities, though, I want you to tell me what type of plane we are looking at here. Is this a sagittal plane? Is this a frontal? Or is this a transverse plane that we're looking at here? Okay, hopefully you answered that this would be a sagittal, and in this case, probably a mid-sagittal cut right down through the middle of the body. So remember, the sagittal cuts it into the right and the left halves. Our body cavities come in two main sections. We have what's called a dorsal body cavity, and then also the ventral body cavity. So thinking back to a minute ago when we were talking about directional terms, we had dorsal versus ventral. Remember that dorsal was referring to the back, or remember our dorsal, I mentioned this idea of a dorsal fin. So if we had a dorsal fin, it would be on our back. And so this is our dorsal area. That's also the dorsal cavity. The dorsal cavity here is this kind of brownish. It's made up of the head, and specifically the brain, and everything that goes along with that, the skull, and then also the spinal cord. That is the dorsal cavity. Notice that the dorsal cavity here is split up into two sections, the cranial cavity and then the spinal cavity. So the cranial cavity is just the brain. The spinal cavity is the spinal cord area. That's how that's split up there. The ventral cavity, on the other hand, the ventral is in the front, and so it entails your lungs, your digestive system, your pelvic region. All of that is going to be part of the ventral body cavity. It can further be broken up into the thoracic cavity. And this thoracic cavity here is this area here, just where your lungs are, basically, your lungs and heart. And then you have the abdominal pelvic cavity, which can further be split up into the abdominal and the pelvic cavity. Notice here that the thing that is separating the two is a diaphragm. So there's a definite section between the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity formed by the diaphragm. In the abdominal pelvic cavity, however, the section there's no actual division between the abdominal cavity and pelvic cavity. That's why we call it abdominal pelvic cavity. But the pelvis itself forms a partial barrier, and so that's where the pelvic cavity would be located versus the abdominal cavity. So depending on which cavity you're talking about, there are different organs found in each of those cavities. So if I say something like the heart, you know that the heart is found in the thoracic cavity. If I mention the large intestine is going to be in your abdominal cavity, though it does poke down into the pelvic cavity as well. Your gonads, the testes, the ovaries, those are going to be in the pelvic cavity. Okay, so depending on what structure you're talking about, what organ you're talking about, it's going to be found in these different cavities. So the cavities are basically just ways to talk about where organs are located and their relationship to each other as well. Last of all, just let me point out that the abdominal pelvic cavity can further be split up into either quadrants, is one way that is split up, or also regions. In this case, in the regions, there are 9 different regions that are used to refer to different parts of the abdominal pelvic region. Because it's such a large cavity, there's a lot of organs there. Doctors will either use these regions or these quadrants to talk about it. The quadrants aren't necessarily very difficult, right and left upper and the right and left lower. Notice again, though, I'll point out here that the right side is referring to the patient's right side, left side referring to the patient's left side as well. So when you're thinking about yourself, your right upper quadrant and left upper quadrant will be your right and left hands, but when you're looking at somebody else, that's going to be opposite. Same thing with the regions here. We have the right side versus the left side, and with a little bit of practice, some of these terms maybe don't make much sense right now, but as you practice memorizing these, you'll recognize these different regions here. The right hypochondriac, hypo meaning up, hypochondriac region, epigastric, epi meaning middle, left hypochondriac region. You have the right lumbar region, umbilical region. If you think back to the directional terms, we had the lumbar region as one of the terms, the regional terms on the body. The left lumbar region, the right iliac referring to the pelvic bone there, hypogastric region, and then the left iliac region. And those are the different regions of the body. That finishes us up for this section of anatomy and physiology, and we'll see you in the next lecture.